Architectures of Spiritual Consciousness, the Compassionate-Liberative Mode. The Central Intuition. There is a simple fact about ordinary consciousness that is so habitual that it rarely appears strange. Pain becomes urgent when it is mine. Hunger becomes urgent when it is mine. Fear, humiliation, loneliness, illness, danger, all of them acquire peculiar gravity when they occur within the organism around which the sense of self has formed. Another person may experience precisely the same states, perhaps with far greater intensity, and yet their suffering can remain strangely distant. It may be understood, regretted, explained, or briefly noticed, but it does not necessarily enter the center from which action arises. The compassionate liberative mind begins when this enclosure becomes permeable. Another being's suffering acquires significance without first having to become my suffering, the suffering of someone I love, the suffering of someone useful to me, or the suffering of someone whose identity resembles my own. Something in consciousness recognizes that the reality of pain does not depend upon who possesses it. A wound is not less painful because it belongs to a stranger. Fear is not less real because it occurs in an enemy. Hunger does not lose its urgency because the hungry being cannot repay us. Your suffering matters even though it is not mine. This is compassion's first intuition, but mature compassion begins rather than ends there. Emotional sensitivity by itself is not yet the mode's mature fruit. A person may resonate intensely with the suffering of others and remain incapable of helping them. Another may be so affected that someone else's distress immediately becomes their own, leaving both people overwhelmed. Affection can create profound concern while remaining confined almost entirely to family, lovers, children, friends, or members of one's own community. Generosity can contain invisible expectations of gratitude, loyalty, conversion, dependence, or return. Mature, compassionate, liberative consciousness undergoes a more radical transformation. The boundary of concern gradually ceases to coincide with the boundary of self-interest. This does not mean that everyone becomes equally intimate. No human being can maintain the same emotional relation with billions of beings, nor should a parent care for every child exactly as they care for their own. Particular love creates particular responsibilities. Friendship, family, community, and vocation establish genuine asymmetries of obligation. Compassion does not abolish these structures. It changes something subtler, the criteria by which another being is allowed to count. A stranger can count, an animal can count, a person who will never know our name can count, someone incapable of returning what was given can count, even someone whose actions require resistance may remain within the field of concern. When the other becomes a subject, ordinary consciousness easily reduces other beings to functions within its own world. One person is useful, another attractive, another threatening, another irritating. One confirms our identity, another challenges it. One belongs to our side, another to the opposing side. Much of social existence can unfold without our fully encountering the extraordinary fact that behind every visible face lies an interior world that is never reducible to its function in our story. The compassionate mind interrupts this reduction. The other person ceases, at least partially, to be merely a character in the drama organized around oneself. They wake into a world. They remember, they fear, they become attached, they lose. They anticipate the future. They carry sensations and histories invisible from outside. Their pain does not occur as an abstract property observable by another person. It occurs with an immediate inwardness, structurally analogous to the inwardness with which our own pain occurs for us. Compassion is therefore not first a moral command. It is a transformation in perception. Before the question, "What should I do?" comes something more fundamental. Someone else has become real. This is why mature compassion cannot be manufactured merely through an identity of goodness. A person may memorize commandments, donate money, volunteer, preach universal love, join humanitarian causes, or perform impressive acts of service while remaining psychologically centered upon themselves. Their actions may still benefit others, but the inner operation of the mode has not necessarily matured. The transformation is quieter. The other is no longer entirely subordinated to the architecture of me and mine. Nor does this require dissolving individuality into an imagined universal psychological organism. Compassion often requires perceiving difference more clearly, not less. What helps one person may damage another. What liberates one may overwhelm another. What feels generous from the perspective of the giver may strengthen dependency in the recipient. The other must therefore remain sufficiently other to be seen rather than absorbed into our projection of their needs. Compassion requires intimacy without possession. The suffering of another must become close enough to matter, but not so thoroughly annexed to the helper's emotional world that the actual person disappears beneath the helper's reaction. More than empathy. Empathy is one natural doorway into this mode, but it is not its culmination. Emotional resonance can awaken concern, yet feeling another person's distress intensely contains no guarantee of wisdom. A parent may become so frightened by a child's anxiety that the parent amplifies it. A helper may rush to remove another person's discomfort because they themselves cannot tolerate witnessing it. Someone facing grief may receive premature consolation, explanation, or spiritual meaning because the observer finds helpless presence unbearable. In these cases, the helper feels deeply, but the suffering person has subtly become an instrument through which the helper attempts to regulate their own nervous system. Mature compassion develops another capacity. I can allow your suffering to affect me without requiring that it become mine. This is neither coldness nor fusion. The compassionate person remains sufficiently open that another being is not abandoned within pain, but sufficiently grounded that response can be shaped by what actually serves the situation rather than by the helper's need to stop feeling uncomfortable. Mature compassion may therefore appear externally quieter than immature empathy. The experienced doctor, parent, therapist, caregiver, or contemplative may not mirror every emotion visibly. The calm is not necessarily absence, it may be increased capacity. The more seriously another being matters, the more seriously one must ask what genuinely helps. Feeling is not enough. Intention is not enough. The identity of being compassionate is certainly not enough. Reality must be allowed to answer. Did the intervention reduce suffering? Did it increase agency? Did it strengthen or weaken dependency? Did it respect the person before us, or did it impose the helper's preferred solution? Compassion begins as openness to suffering and gradually becomes willingness to let reality correct concern. From suffering to freedom. At its first movement, compassion responds to what hurts. Someone is hungry, food matters. Someone is injured, treatment matters. Someone is frightened and alone, presence matters. This immediate responsiveness should never be dismissed as spiritually superficial. Traditions sometimes become so fascinated by root causes that they bypass the concrete wound in front of them. A starving person does not primarily need a discourse on craving. Someone in immediate danger does not need metaphysics before protection. But compassionate liberative consciousness does not stop with relief. Suffering returns, and the mode begins asking why. Why does this person repeatedly return to the same destructive situation? Why does violence reproduce itself across generations? What sustains addiction, dependency, hatred, despair, humiliation, or powerlessness? What conditions continually recreate what compassionate action has temporarily alleviated? This is where compassion becomes liberative. It seeks not merely the disappearance of present discomfort, but increasing freedom from the structures through which suffering continually regenerates. Feed now, understand causes, strengthen freedom. This deepening is one reason Mahayana Buddhism gives compassion such structural importance. Beings and their suffering are understood within causes and conditions rather than as isolated metaphysical essences. Here, an apparently abstract insight produces a profoundly compassionate consequence. If the suffering being is not fixed, suffering need not be treated as destiny. The frightened person is not eternally fear. The wounded person is not exhausted by the wound. The addicted person is not metaphysically addiction. The violent person cannot be reduced without remainder to violence. This does not mean pretending destructive behavior is harmless. Compassion refuses two opposite reductions. One says that the present condition reveals what a person simply is and can never cease to be. The other says that because everything is empty or conditioned, conduct ultimately does not matter. Mature compassion says neither. It can recognize wrongdoing with complete clarity while refusing to turn the wrongdoer into an immutable essence. To see wrongdoing without requiring the wrongdoer to become metaphysically disposable is one of the mode's most difficult achievements. Kandrakirti and the deepening of compassion. Perhaps nowhere is this inner logic expressed more clearly than in the Mahayana conjunction of compassion and emptiness associated with Kandrakirti's Madhyama Kavatara. Compassion does not appear merely as elementary morality awaiting transcendence by sophisticated philosophy. It accompanies the bodhisattva path as understanding itself deepens. Traditional presentations distinguish compassion toward beings visibly undergoing suffering, compassion informed by insight into conditioned and impermanent phenomena, and compassion joined to the realization that beings themselves are empty of intrinsic existence. At first, this creates a paradox. If no independently existing self can ultimately be found, who suffers? If helper and helped are dependently arisen, why should their relation retain spiritual significance? One might expect metaphysical solidity to disappear and compassion to disappear with it. Yet the Mahayana movement goes in the opposite direction. Compassion survives the disappearance of metaphysical solidity. Indeed, something within it becomes purer. The ordinary structure says, I, the compassionate one, help you, the suffering one. Deeper insight loosens every possessive element of the sentence. The I is not a self-grounding entity. The you is not a fixed object waiting to be repaired. Suffering has conditions. Response has conditions. The relation itself arises through conditions. And still there is response. The culmination of compassion is therefore not an infinitely expanded savior. It may be almost the reverse. The compassion itself becomes less solid, while compassion becomes more available. The other person no longer has to become evidence of one's goodness. Their gratitude does not certify the gift. Their transformation need not become one's possession. Their refusal need not constitute personal defeat. Wisdom begins removing the helper from the center of helping, the widening circle. Human concern normally begins through intimacy, and nothing is defective about this. Love makes particular beings irreplaceable. A parent's responsibility toward their own child cannot be distributed evenly across humanity. Friendship establishes obligations that do not exist identically between strangers. Compassion does not ask us to destroy particular love. It asks whether particular love must require universal indifference. Does the fact that my child matters enormously require another child to matter not at all? Does loyalty to my community require blindness towards suffering caused by my community? Does the fact that someone has become my enemy mean their pain has ceased to be pain? The mature fruit is not equal emotional intensity toward everyone. Such equality is neither psychologically possible nor spiritually necessary. The change is more sober. The right to count becomes increasingly independent of the right to belong to me. This introduces instability into every close moral tribe. Families, nations, religions, political movements, communities, and individuals naturally create reasons why the suffering inside their boundary should count more. Compassion does not necessarily abolish loyalty, but it prevents belonging from becoming the sole condition of moral reality. There is always the disturbing possibility that the being outside the boundary is also real. The enemy test. Compassion reaches one of its hardest thresholds when concern encounters hostility. Compassion toward an innocent child is comparatively easy. Compassion toward a person who has humiliated, threatened, betrayed, or harmed us is something else entirely. At this boundary, compassion must distinguish itself from permissiveness. Understanding the conditions through which a destructive person was formed does not absolve destructive action. Wishing freedom from hatred or delusion for someone does not mean placing their interests above those whom they harm. Compassion may require protection, separation, restraint, consequence, resistance, exclusion, or an unequivocal no. What changes is not necessarily the firmness of action, it is the necessity of dehumanization. I can stop what you are doing without requiring your capacity to suffer to become irrelevant. This is exceptionally difficult because hatred simplifies the moral field. It divides the world into beings whose suffering matters and beings whose suffering does not. Compassion introduces complexity again. It does not abolish justice. It prevents justice from requiring metaphysical hatred. The enemy may remain dangerous. Trust may never return. Reconciliation may be impossible. Forgiveness may not be the immediate task. The compassionate intuition is narrower and harder. I do not need your suffering to become meaningless in order to oppose you. The courage to remain. Compassion is often imagined as softness because many of its gestures are gentle, yet one of its deepest fruits is courage. Suffering is difficult to remain near. When another person is in profound grief, illness, humiliation, fear, or helplessness, consciousness naturally looks for an exit, explanation, distraction, solution, reassurance, spiritual interpretation, blame, optimism. Any of these may occasionally be appropriate. They can also become ways of escaping the recognition that sometimes nothing available can make reality immediately different. Mature compassion develops the capacity to remain, not indefinitely and not without boundaries, but long enough that another person does not have to become less real merely because their suffering cannot presently be solved. Sometimes compassion has medicine, knowledge, protection, food, or practical intervention. Sometimes it has almost nothing except presence. At this limit, compassion encounters something very different from omnipotence. I can care without being able to save. Death remains, loss remains, irreversibility remains, finitude remains. Compassion cannot be measured only through successful intervention because reality includes suffering no human power can abolish. There are times when liberation means changing conditions, and times when it means strengthening the freedom and dignity with which unavoidable conditions are met. The inability to fix everything does not become an argument for caring about nothing. The mature promise. The compassionate liberative mind, therefore, does not make its deepest promise by declaring that it will save the world. That formulation already places the heroic self too prominently at the center. Its mature promise is quieter. It refuses to make another being unreal merely because their life is not mine. It refuses to confuse the limits of personal power with the limits of another being's significance. It seeks not merely to relieve suffering in ways that confirm the helper's goodness, but to understand what genuinely allows bondage to loosen. It permits wisdom to correct compassion without allowing wisdom to become indifference. Eventually, it allows even the identity of being compassionate to become unnecessary. The highest fruit of the mode is therefore not maximal emotional sensitivity, endless sacrifice, or heroic responsibility for existence. Another being becomes fully real without becoming one's possession. Their suffering can enter concern without being appropriated. Their freedom can be desired without being owned. Their transformation can be welcomed even when it removes the need for one's help. Their refusal can be respected without canceling their dignity. Their wrongdoing can be opposed without requiring their dehumanization. Their pain can matter even where nothing finally can be done about it. The suffering is not mine. The life is not mine. The liberation is not mine. Yet none of this makes the other irrelevant. The deepest compassion begins where possession ends, but concern does not. What the compassionate liberative mind is not. Compassion is among the easiest spiritual qualities to praise and among the hardest to define without contamination. Religions praise kindness. Political movements justify themselves through concern for suffering. Families demand sacrifice in the language of love. Teachers discipline for the student's supposed benefit. Missionaries act for salvation. Institutions speak of service. Parents speak of protection. Helpers speak of care. Because compassion carries enormous moral prestige, many psychological operations can borrow its name. The relevant question is therefore not merely whether someone performs actions that look helpful. The deeper question is what happens to the reality, dignity, agency, and freedom of the other person inside the act of helping. Compassion becomes counterfeit whenever something else begins to matter more than the being supposedly being served. It is not pity, fusion, or niceness. Pity recognizes suffering, but may preserve a vertical distance. The unfortunate person remains below, while the fortunate observer stands above and feels sorrow for them. Pity can inspire genuine generosity and is not something to despise, but the other can remain primarily an object of feeling rather than a subject encountered in their own right. Empathy comes closer, but empathy is not compassion either. It allows one person to resonate with another's experience, sometimes with extraordinary intensity, yet emotional resonance can overwhelm discernment. A frightened child can make a parent panic. A grieving friend can make the listener so distressed that the listener begins providing solutions mainly to regulate their own discomfort. Projection may be mistaken for understanding. Mature compassion, therefore, does not seek maximal permeability. It seeks permeability without fusion. I can be affected by your suffering without becoming your suffering, close enough that you are not abandoned, differentiated enough that I can still see, nor is compassion identical with niceness. Gentle speech, harmony, reassurance, agreeableness, and willingness to give may all be compassionate in the right situation. They may also arise from fear of conflict, need for approval, inability to tolerate anger, or unwillingness to disappoint. Compassion can be tender in feeling and uncompromising in action. It may protect, refuse, expose, separate, confront, or leave. The compassionate act is not defined by how pleasant it feels. It is tested by what it actually serves. It is not devotional love. Compassion and devotion can overlap deeply, but they are not the same mode. The devotional relational mind is organized around relationship to the beloved, love, surrender, fidelity, longing, intimacy, presence, absence, and the transformation of the lover through relation. Compassion begins from another axis. It asks whether the suffering, dignity, and freedom of another being can matter even when that being is not mine, not beloved, not emotionally intimate, and perhaps not even personally known. A devotee may love one form of the divine with overwhelming exclusivity while having comparatively little development of universal compassion. A compassionate person may care deeply about a stranger, animal, prisoner, patient, political opponent, or enemy without experiencing anything resembling devotional intimacy. Particular love intensifies the incomparable value of the beloved. Compassion widens the field of beings whose reality cannot simply be dismissed. Devotional consciousness naturally says, "You are irreplaceable to me." Compassion says something different. "You do not have to belong to me in order to matter." The modes may enrich one another. Devotion can give compassion, warmth, and fidelity. Compassion can prevent devotion from becoming morally enclosed within the beloved relationship, but they remain distinct movements of consciousness. It is not rescue or ownership. The desire to help becomes distorted when another person's difficulty begins organizing the helper's identity. The rescuer does not merely want suffering to decrease, they need to become the one through whom it decreases. This difference may remain hidden for years because rescuing can produce genuine benefit. The decisive moment arrives when the other person becomes stronger. Do they become freer or ungrateful? Does decreasing dependency produce satisfaction or emptiness and injury? Compassion wants the other person to flourish. Saviorism needs the relationship of rescue. Compassion wants freedom. The Savior needs to remain necessary. Concern can therefore never mean ownership of another person's destiny. A person may reject advice, return to destructive patterns, hold values the helper does not share, or choose a path that appears unwise. Genuine care naturally wants a good result, but another person is not an extension of the helper's agency. I may have responsibilities toward you without possessing responsibility for your entire destiny. Without this distinction, love becomes supervision, help becomes control, and concern becomes surveillance. The liberative mode does not abolish influence, it abolishes ownership. There is an important qualification. Freedom does not always mean independence. A small child, someone living with profound disability, a chronically ill person, or someone approaching death may require enduring care. The success of compassion cannot therefore be measured by whether every recipient becomes self sufficient. Where independence is possible, healthy help should not unnecessarily obstruct it. Where enduring dependence belongs to the actual condition of a life, compassion seeks the greatest available dignity, agency, participation, reciprocity, and freedom within that dependence. The point is not independence at any cost. It is the reduction of unnecessary bondage and possession. The helper should become unnecessary where possible. Where this is impossible, the relationship should become as non possessive as possible. It is not unlimited giving or self erasure. Because compassion is associated with generosity, unlimited giving can appear spiritually superior. Give more, sacrifice more, sleep less, serve longer, endure everything, place everyone else first. The person who stops appears selfish. But a finite human organism cannot behave as though its resources were infinite. Time, energy, money, physical health, attention, knowledge, psychological capacity, and responsibility all have limits. Confusing unlimited concern with unlimited action eventually produces exhaustion, resentment, moral debt, control, collapse, or the need to be needed. The field of compassion may be without boundary. The responsibility of one person is not. A related distortion says, other beings matter, therefore I should not. The practitioner treats their own exhaustion as insufficient surrender, their boundaries as selfishness, their wish for privacy as coldness, and their own suffering as always less legitimate than another person's need. But this contradicts the logic of universal concern. If suffering matters, the practitioner is not mysteriously excluded from the category of beings. My suffering does not matter more merely because it is mine. It does not matter less either. Sacrifice may sometimes be necessary and may even become extraordinary, but sacrifice is a contextual act, not the metaphysical definition of goodness. Compassion ceases to be universal when the helper becomes the one being who is permitted to be treated as expendable. It is not the abolition of judgment. Because compassion seeks to understand the causes of suffering and destructive conduct, it may be mistaken for an instruction to excuse everything. A person may have been traumatized, conditioned by violence, shaped by fear, or caught in ignorance. These conditions matter enormously. They do not erase consequences. Understanding how a destructive person developed is not equivalent to declaring their behavior harmless. Indeed, causal understanding may intensify the need to interrupt what continually reproduces suffering. Protecting one person can require restricting another. Concern for someone caught in destructive behavior may require refusing to cooperate with that behavior. Mature compassion seeks something harder than either condemnation or permissiveness. Understanding without exoneration. Accountability without dehumanization. For this reason, compassion is not pacifism in the simple sense of avoiding all confrontation. Some situations contain tragic conflicts in which every available option carries suffering. Protecting a vulnerable person may require forceful resistance. Stopping abuse may provoke conflict. Justice may require consequences. Compassion cannot guarantee moral purity in advance. It has to operate inside a reality where values sometimes collide. The question becomes, what action among imperfect possibilities most responsibly protects life, dignity, agency, and the conditions for future freedom? Sometimes tenderness is required, sometimes an unequivocal no, este acupă. It is not the sacralization of suffering. Spiritual traditions have often discovered profound meaning within unavoidable suffering. Pain can become part of courage, solidarity, wisdom, surrender, or transformation. This can protect consciousness from despair when reality cannot be changed. But a decisive distinction must remain. Unavoidable suffering may become meaningful without preventable suffering becoming desirable. Once suffering itself receives spiritual prestige, compassion can reverse direction. Poverty becomes noble, pain becomes purification, endurance becomes holiness. The person's ability to suffer beautifully becomes more important than asking whether the suffering could responsibly have been prevented. Compassion asks first whether needless suffering can be reduced. Only after the limits of action become clear does the question of how suffering may be borne enter its proper place. Mature compassion accepts suffering it cannot remove. It does not romanticize suffering it can. It is not proselytism or benevolent control. Religious traditions often understand transmission as compassion, and sometimes rightly so. A person discovers something that transformed their life and naturally wants to share it, but a corruption begins when another person's welfare becomes inseparable from adopting the helper's worldview. The diagnosis is known before the encounter: unbeliever, conditioned soul, materialist, unawakened person, lost person. The solution is likewise predetermined. Accept the teaching, join the community, follow the master, read the book, adopt the worldview. The human being has become an instance of the helper's theory. A decisive test follows. Would this person still matter to me if they never accepted my solution? If concern disappears when the teaching is refused, the care was partly instrumental. The same problem appears in non-religious forms. It is for your own good can justify pressure, deception, manipulation, removal of choice, or humiliation. The intention may be benevolent, but the means still matter because the other person's relation to their own agency is itself part of the outcome. A technique that increases compliance is not automatically compassionate merely because the helper considers the destination beneficial. Liberation achieved by making another person progressively dependent upon the liberator contains an obvious contradiction. It is not service to a system, through a person. Compassion can become especially difficult to examine when institutionalized. Organizations may perform real and important service while gradually equating their own expansion with the welfare of those they serve. Membership grows, donations rise, more programs are delivered, books distributed, patients processed, recruits gained, missions established. These numbers are visible and measurable. Human freedom is harder to measure. A subtle equation then takes hold. What benefits the organization benefits living beings. Once this becomes unquestionable, the person can become both recipient and resource. They are helped, but also counted, recruited, represented, retained, or used as proof of the institution's compassionate mission. The distinction is not always clean. Institutions need resources and continuity to provide genuine benefit. The danger arises when system preservation can no longer be distinguished from service. The necessary question is simple. Am I serving this being, or am I serving my system through this being? A mature institution should be capable of wanting those it serves to outgrow its services where possible. If the persistence of suffering becomes structurally necessary for the institution's identity, authority, funding, or purpose, compassion has begun serving its own continuation. It is not moral superiority. Few identities are harder to challenge than the identity of being compassionate. The ascetic may be accused of severity, the intellectual of arrogance, the ritualist of rigidity, but the compassionate person can answer criticism with a morally protected statement, I only care about people. Boundaries then become selfishness, disagreement becomes coldness, questions about outcomes become attacks upon goodness, resistance becomes lack of empathy, the identity begins sealing itself. The actual condition of the person helped must matter more than the helper's identity as compassionate. If help fails, the method must be examinable. If dependency increases, this must matter. If resentment appears, it must matter. If an institution grows while those it serves remain powerless, this must matter. If the helper's family or health is destroyed by universal service, this must matter. Compassion loses integrity wherever moral intention becomes immunity from evidence. It is not universal rescue. The compassionate impulse naturally contains a protest. May suffering cease. At its widest horizon, this becomes the beautiful Mahayana aspiration that all beings be free from suffering. Yet, interpreted crudely, the aspiration can mutate into metaphysical grandiosity. A finite person begins imagining themselves responsible for repairing existence itself. The universe becomes a failed project awaiting compassionate correction. Finitude, vulnerability, loss, risk, and difference begin appearing as defects that an enlightened administrator ought eventually to eliminate. Mature compassion requires humility before existence. Universal compassion does not require a universal rescue project. All beings may define a horizon beyond which concern refuses to close, without becoming a literal administrative assignment undertaken by one heroic individual. Compassion can orient itself universally while acting finitely. This matters equally in politics. Utopian compassion sees suffering produced by social structures and imagines a perfected future. Such imagination can generate enormous good, but when the future becomes morally absolute, living people who resist the project can become obstacles. They may be harmed in the name of a future world in which nobody will be harmed. The imagined humanity becomes more real than the human being standing in front of us. The compassionate-liberative mode therefore rejects both indifference to structural suffering and utopian possession of history. The essential distinction. The counterfeits of compassion share one structure. Something begins to matter more than the actual reality and freedom of the being supposedly being served. The helper's goodness, emotional comfort, need to be needed, institution, ideology, family harmony, guru's authority, imagined future, purity of sacrifice, or preservation of a compassionate identity. The mature mode repeatedly returns from these abstractions to the subject before it. Not a convert, not a dependent, not a victim whose pain gives meaning to the helper, not evidence of virtue, not material for a program, a living center whose reality exceeds every role compassion assigns to them. The decisive question is therefore not merely am I compassionate? It is, does the way I care leave the other being more real, more dignified, and, where possible, more free? Compassion is not the disappearance of boundaries. It is not emotional fusion. It is not endless giving. It is not moral innocence. It is not universal jurisdiction. It is not exemption from judgment. It is the refusal to let judgment become indifference, and the refusal to let concern become possession. The other matters, but the other does not become mine. The world from within. The compassionate liberative mind does not initially experience the world as a list of moral duties. Something changes at the level of salience. Certain things become harder not to notice. A frightened face, the fatigue in someone's body, a child looking toward an adult for protection, an animal recoiling, a tone of humiliation, someone concealing grief, a person becoming harsh because fear has entered them. Nothing supernatural has necessarily happened. The world itself has not changed. What changes is the distribution of reality within attention. The self is no longer the only location from which urgency can arise. Another interior. One of the strangest facts of ordinary existence is that every person appears externally while living internally. We encounter a face, a body, a voice, a role, yet behind what can be seen is an entire field we cannot directly enter. Memories, associations, sensations, fears, desires, expectations, meanings, wounds, confusions, and private interpretations of the present moment. Ordinary consciousness knows this intellectually and forgets it constantly. The other becomes flattened into what they mean for us: friend, colleague, stranger, enemy, patient, cashier, beggar, follower, opponent, problem. The compassionate mode repeatedly restores depth behind these roles. There is somebody in there. Not necessarily somebody in the sense of a permanent metaphysical essence. Something simpler is meant. Experience is occurring from a center that is not mine. The old person moving slowly through a doorway experiences the body from within. The frightened animal does not experience itself as an object in the human world. The crying child does not experience fear as trivial merely because an adult knows the danger is small. The stranger whose behavior irritates me possesses a history that is largely invisible. The inwardness of another being ceases to be merely theoretical. The weight of small things. Once this shift occurs, apparently trivial events can acquire unusual significance. A harsh sentence may remain in another person for years. A small humiliation may be invisible to everyone except the one carrying it. 2 minutes of genuine attention may become disproportionately important to someone who has been ignored for months. Compassion becomes increasingly sensitive to the asymmetry between external size and internal impact. An act may look small from outside and be enormous from within. The reverse is equally true. Large donations can coexist with contempt. Public service can coexist with indifference. A dramatic sacrifice can serve the identity of the giver more than the life receiving it. What matters is not how large the act appears from outside, but what actually occurs within the life it touches. This gives the mode a distinctive intimacy with ordinary life. Some spiritual paths naturally gather around extraordinary events: revelation, initiation, samadhi, austerity, doctrinal breakthrough. Compassion may reach one of its purest expressions through something almost embarrassingly small. Someone was hungry and was fed. Someone was frightened and was not mocked. Someone was sick and received care. Someone was alone and another person stayed. Nothing spectacular happened, yet another being suffered less because someone noticed. For this mode, that fact can possess spiritual weight. The expansion of relevance. The ordinary field of concern is organized through proximity: my body, my plans, my family, my friends, my community, my country, my beliefs, my side. This structure is neither irrational nor purely selfish. Human beings have concrete responsibilities toward particular people. Compassion introduces another axis through these circles. Someone does not have to belong to me in order to become relevant. Concern may begin with those we love and then include acquaintances, strangers, culturally distant people, beings incapable of reciprocity, people we dislike, and eventually those whose actions we actively oppose. The expansion is not smooth. Concern contracts and widens. The suffering stranger may feel vividly real one day and disappear into the background the next. An enemy may suddenly become human in one circumstance and return to abstraction when conflict intensifies. Maturity does not require permanent emotional intensity. It makes certain exclusions harder to absolutize. Their distance from me does not alter the reality of their experience. The collapse of moral convenience. This makes the world morally more difficult. Hatred is easier when the hated person can be reduced to what they have done. Political conflict is easier when another population becomes a category. Family conflict is easier when one person is simply the villain. Religious polemic becomes easier when outsiders are reduced to ignorance, impurity, delusion, or condemnation. Compassion complicates these stories, not by declaring everyone equally right or dissolving responsibility, but by restoring human density where moral simplification had removed it. A person may be cruel and frightened, manipulative and wounded, dangerous and capable of suffering, responsible and conditioned, a victim in one relationship and an aggressor in another. None of these truths cancels the others. The mind wants one clean conclusion. Compassion keeps returning additional information. Yes, what happened was wrong, and yes, this remains a living being. Hatred can feel cleaner. Compassion is often more difficult precisely because it sees too much to reduce the person completely. Seeing conditions without erasing responsibility. As the mode matures, behavior increasingly appears within conditions. Anger has causes, fear has causes. Addiction is not produced simply by lack of will. Fanaticism emerges within histories, institutions, identities, wounds, incentives, narratives, and communities. A destructive person may themselves have been formed within violence. None of this absolves behavior. Compassion becomes interested in conditions because suffering and harmful action will continue if their causes remain untouched. Instead of asking only how to punish behavior, it asks what keeps producing it. Instead of merely asking why a person will not change, it asks what presently makes change difficult. Instead of treating a label as an explanation, it asks what sequence of causes continually recreates the labeled condition. This shift from essence to causality makes transformation imaginable. If a pattern is not the whole being, the pattern may change. Not automatically, not easily, not merely because another person wants it to, but the present configuration no longer possesses metaphysical ownership of the future. The enemy remains human. Hostility contracts perception with extraordinary force. When threatened, attention narrows around the threatening function of the other person. Their fear becomes irrelevant. Their humiliation may become satisfying. Their pain begins to feel deserved. This mechanism has obvious survival value and also makes cruelty possible. Compassion interferes with the totality of this reduction. One may still need to defend oneself or others. One may need distance, law, resistance, consequence, removal, or force. Yet the enemy does not become metaphysically unreal. The compassionate person may feel anger without desiring needless suffering, may want an aggressor stopped without wanting them degraded beyond recognition, and may even experience sorrow that another human being became capable of what now requires opposition. This is not sentimental reconciliation. Sometimes trust should never return. The mature intuition is smaller and harder. I do not need your suffering to become meaningless in order to oppose you. This is one of compassion's deepest victories over tribal consciousness. Spacious concern. At earlier stages, the suffering of another can enter consciousness almost violently. Their fear becomes our fear, their grief floods the nervous system, and their urgency becomes inseparable from our own. This can feel like profound compassion because distance appears to disappear, yet the actual other may disappear as well. The observer becomes consumed by their own reaction. Mature compassion develops a different kind of closeness. The person can remain affected without becoming flooded. Within that space, they can listen, ask, wait, distinguish, and sometimes refrain from immediate action. The nervous system becomes less compelled to mirror suffering and more capable of remaining available to it. This is why mature compassion may appear less emotionally dramatic. It no longer has to prove its reality through visible distress. Calm can be capacity rather than coldness. The same spaciousness permits presence without solution. Some problems cannot be solved now, some cannot be solved by us, and some cannot be repaired at all. A relationship has ended. A loss is irreversible. The body may be dying. A person may refuse every available path. History has already occurred. The impulse to fix then meets helplessness. Advice, hope, meaning, technique, and spiritual explanation may all become escape routes from the intolerable fact that we cannot change what another person is undergoing. Mature compassion can distinguish I cannot fix this from, therefore I must withdraw. Sometimes the deepest available act is to prevent abandonment. Agency enters. Compassion. Compassion initially perceives another being through vulnerability. They are hurt, endangered, frightened. deprived. As the mode matures, another dimension becomes equally important. They are also an agent. They possess preferences, values, interpretations, dignity, resistance, and a capacity for decisions the helper may consider unwise. This alters compassionate perception profoundly. A person may refuse advice, treatment, financial help, spiritual teaching, reconciliation, or a path the helper considers obviously better. Compassion does not automatically endorse such choices. It begins, however, to experience the violation of agency as a harm in its own right. The question shifts from, how do I make the right outcome happen, to something more difficult. How do I remain responsive without turning the other person into an object of benevolent management? Watching someone choose badly may be harder than helping someone who wants help. Yet respect for agency marks one of the mode's deepest maturations. I want your freedom strongly enough that I must allow it to include choices I would not make for you. Again, this is not absolute. Children, immediate danger, incapacity, and responsibilities of care complicate the picture. But as a mature orientation, compassion seeks to enlarge rather than colonize the other person's capacity to stand inside their own life. Joy in another's flourishing. Compassion is naturally associated with suffering, yet its mature development must also change our relationship to another person's happiness. Someone recovers, becomes stronger, receives recognition, finds love, becomes more capable, no longer needs advice, or outgrows the helper. What arises? Joy or comparison, satisfaction or loss of purpose? It can be easier to help the wounded because the relationship gives the helper a clear place. Flourishing changes the relationship. The giver becomes less central. This is why sympathetic joy is an indispensable companion to compassion. The mature consciousness does not merely say, may you suffer less. It can say, may your life become more fully yours, even when that removes me from its center. The person's recovery is not the loss of the role. Where the role was genuinely liberative, it is the fulfillment of the role. Attention as gift. Compassion also alters the quality of attention itself. Much ordinary listening is preparatory. While another person speaks, we construct a response, compare with our own experience, interpret, diagnose, search for solutions, or wait for our turn. When another person becomes sufficiently real, attention can temporarily cease revolving around oneself. One listens longer, with less compulsion to convert what is heard immediately into one's own categories. This kind of attention does not magically solve suffering. Yet isolation is part of many forms of suffering, and being seen accurately without immediate judgment or appropriation can reduce that isolation. For a moment, the person is not a problem, not a case, not someone to save. They are simply allowed to exist within another person's awareness. Sometimes the entire compassionate act is, I heard you, oikwakker, a heavier, more populated world. Compassion is not simply pleasant. A world populated by fully real beings is heavier than one populated primarily by functions. Statistics become persons. War becomes individual nervous systems. Poverty becomes specific bodies. Cruelty becomes somebody's actual experience. Expanded concern therefore requires another maturation. The ability to remain open without demanding total exposure. No finite person can continuously absorb the suffering of the planet. Attention must narrow. Daily life still requires work, sleep, humor, play, beauty, concentration, and particular relationships. Compassion is not constant surveillance of pain. It is a changed relation to what enters the field. This prevents the mode from turning openness into self-destruction. The compassionate person need not search compulsively for suffering to prove concern. When suffering actually appears, the reflex of absolute exclusion has become weaker. Vulnerability and the ordinary sacred. Some spiritual modes sacralize temples, revelation, silence, beauty, mantra, sacred form, or philosophical insight. Compassion can sacralize vulnerability, not because vulnerability is desirable, but because when a living being becomes exposed to harm, something worthy of care becomes visible. This can transform ordinary human activities into spiritual operations without requiring explicitly spiritual language. Medicine, caregiving, teaching, parenting, shelter, feeding, protection, listening. Another being was vulnerable, and vulnerability did not meet indifference. The act need not be metaphysically inflated. Its dignity may be enough. A different center of gravity. The compassionate liberative mind does not abolish selfhood. The person continues to feel their own body more directly than another's. Their own pain hurts immediately. Their intimate relationships remain particular, responsibilities remain bounded, but the gravitational structure has changed. The self is still a center. It is no longer the only center whose reality is self evident. Other centers enter the field. This does not create equality of obligation in every circumstance. It creates a widening of existential seriousness. Another being's interiority is no longer decorative scenery around one's life. The world becomes populated, not merely by objects, categories, and bodies, but by countless loci of experience, each living from within a perspective that can never be completely entered, and yet becomes partially visible through speech, gesture, suffering, joy, fear, hope, silence, and relationship. The compassionate consciousness cannot possess these worlds. It cannot save all of them. It cannot understand them completely. Their distance, nevertheless, ceases to be sufficient reason for indifference. At maturity, the phenomenology becomes almost simple. Someone appears. Their life is not mine. Their choices are not mine. Their suffering is not mine. Their liberation cannot become my possession. And still, consciousness recognizes you are here too. Sometimes this recognition becomes help, protection, listening, restraint, refusal, grief, or joy. Sometimes it becomes simply the decision not to turn away internally, but the world has already changed. There are others here, and their being here matters. The central operation and mature fruit. The compassionate liberative mode begins with a widening of concern, but concern alone cannot carry it to maturity. It reaches its characteristic depth when compassion becomes joined to discernment about the causes of suffering, the willingness to act without possessing the result, and eventually the ability to remain responsive even as the metaphysical solidity of Savior and saved begins to weaken. This is where the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal becomes simultaneously magnificent and dangerous. Its language can sound almost impossibly grandiose. Awakening is generated for the sake of all beings. No category is finally excluded. The horizon expands beyond any imaginable individual capacity. Taken crudely, this sounds like the spiritual ego enlarged to cosmic proportions. Yet the very traditions that extend compassion toward all beings also subject the compassionate self, the beings to be liberated, and the act of liberation itself to the analysis of emptiness. The paradox is deliberate. The horizon of compassion becomes infinite at precisely the same time that ownership of compassion is dismantled. The vow that cannot be completed. The bodhisattva aspiration is easily misunderstood when interpreted as an ordinary project. An ordinary project possesses a finite object: build the house, heal the patient, complete the manuscript, feed a given population, teach the students. At some point, success can be declared, the work is finished. The Mahayana horizon refuses this closure. Beings are innumerable, conditions continually change, causes of suffering reproduce themselves, worlds arise and disappear. No ordinary individual could stand outside existence and verify that compassionate work had been completed. If the vow means that one finite ego personally assumes responsibility for engineering a final universe in which every being has been liberated, it becomes psychologically absurd. Its deeper function is different. The impossibility transforms the practitioner. All beings destroys the arithmetic through which concern continually asks which lives count and where concern may finally close. The vow prevents the creation of a permanent class of beings whose liberation has become irrelevant. No class of beings is permitted to become metaphysically worthless. The vow is therefore infinite primarily as orientation, not personal jurisdiction. The compassionate field has no final wall. Action does. One body can be in one place. One human being has limited knowledge, energy, skill, money, attention, and time. Mahayana aspiration does not abolish these realities. It refuses to convert finitude into indifference. I do not require assurance that compassion will someday finish its work before allowing compassion to operate now. This is why the bodhisattva orientation must become resistant to discouragement. If compassionate action were justified only by guaranteed completion, the immeasurability of suffering would destroy the path immediately. Mature compassion acts without demanding cosmic success as the price of concern. It can say, I cannot repair the universe, and still this suffering matters. Universal concern without universal jurisdiction. There is a profound difference between saying that no being is outside the horizon of concern and saying that every being is my responsibility. The first expands compassion, the second can inflate the self to monstrous proportions. The mature fruit lies in holding the first while relinquishing the second. A person can wish freedom for beings they will never meet, resist delight in the suffering of enemies, support institutions that alleviate distant forms of suffering, and organize their life around reducing harm without imagining themselves the administrator of creation. This is where emptiness becomes indispensable. Emptiness prevents universality from becoming empire. Compassion expands without limit, while the self that might claim ownership of the expansion is simultaneously examined. The mature orientation moves away from everyone must become what I know they should become towards something quieter. May conditions for freedom increase wherever beings remain caught in suffering and confusion. And then comes the practical question, what can actually be done here? The cosmic horizon returns to the particular person, place, moment, capacity, and relationship in which compassion must become real. From aspiration to conduct. Universal ideals can remain aesthetically beautiful while leaving life structurally unchanged. One can admire bodhicitta, feel moved by suffering, speak eloquently about humanity, and experience intense concern when encountering tragedy without translating the perception into conduct. Santideva's distinction between aspirational bodhicitta and the bodhicitta that has entered conduct guards against this. Wishing to undertake the journey and actually setting out are not the same movement. The mature mode therefore asks what compassion changes. Does attention change? Speech? Money? The willingness to exploit? The capacity to intervene? The ability to notice suffering that convenience previously rendered invisible? Does one become capable of helping more competently rather than merely feeling more strongly? Compassion moves from sentiment toward embodiment, yet activity does not certify compassion either. Service can become compulsive, intervention can increase dependency, helping can become identity. The question remains, what kind of action actually contributes to freedom? Relief, cause, and liberation. The central operation can be understood through three deepening movements. The first is immediate relief. Someone is hungry, feed them. Someone is injured, treat the injury. Someone is in danger, protect them. Someone is frightened and alone, remain near. Compassion begins by respecting concrete reality rather than bypassing it. The second movement asks why suffering returns. A person repeatedly needs emergency assistance. What sustains the condition? A destructive relationship is repeatedly re entered. What makes the pattern so adhesive? Violence continually reappears in a community. What reproduces it? Addiction persists. What conditions feed the cycle? Compassion becomes causal intelligence. The third movement is liberative. It asks what might make the person less dependent upon the conditions that repeatedly generate suffering. Education, health, social conditions, psychological maturation, spiritual insight, ethical cultivation, community, competence, agency, and economic conditions may all become relevant. Feed now. Understand causes. Strengthen freedom. Immediate relief and long term liberation are not competitors. Compassion becomes distorted when it sacrifices the suffering person before it to an abstract future, but it also becomes shallow when the immediate act of help itself becomes sufficient proof that nothing deeper needs to change. The test of agency. The word liberative becomes especially demanding here because help can reduce pain while weakening agency. A teacher may answer every question until the student stops thinking. A parent can prevent every failure until the child becomes unable to tolerate consequence. An institution can stabilize vulnerable people while making departure increasingly difficult. A spiritual community can offer meaning while progressively replacing individual judgment. Immediate distress decreases, yet something has gone wrong. The mature question is therefore not only, did suffering decrease? It is, what happened to the other person's capacity to stand? Sometimes the most compassionate response will frustrate the person being helped. A destructive demand may need to be refused. A repeated rescue may need to stop. Someone may become angry because the helper is no longer willing to absorb consequences that belong to them. This is not a universal justification for withholding help. Sometimes withdrawal is simply abandonment. Mature compassion has to distinguish the two through context rather than ideology. And again, freedom cannot be reduced to self sufficiency. Some lives involve enduring dependence. The liberative criterion is therefore not, can this person exist without receiving care, but rather, does care enlarge the dignity, participation, choice, voice, and agency genuinely available to this person, or does it unnecessarily reduce them? Liberation is not always independence, it is the loosening of avoidable bondage. Skillful means. Universal concern does not imply uniform response. If beings differ in temperament, history, capacity, conditions, worldview, and forms of suffering, compassion cannot prescribe the same intervention to everyone. This is the practical dignity of upaya, skillful means. Compassion is universal in concern and particular in response. One person needs comfort, another confrontation. One needs instruction, another silence. One requires material assistance, another needs the dignity of solving something independently. One may benefit from spiritual teaching, another should not be proselytized at all. Uniformity may indicate that the helper has stopped seeing. When every person needs the same doctrine, institution, therapeutic language, political program, spiritual practice, or model of life, compassion has begun serving a system rather than the being. The mature question becomes, what is this particular situation actually asking? Not, how can I fit this person into the solution I already possess? Compassion and emptiness. The deepest Mahayana paradox now appears. Compassion seems structurally dual. There is a compassionate subject, a suffering object, and an act linking them. I help you. A strongly non dual or subtractive perspective might regard this structure as spiritually provisional. If self and other are empty, who helps whom? Mahayana does not resolve the tension by abandoning compassion. It radicalizes both sides. Conventionally, beings suffer, consequences arise, choices matter, and compassion responds. Ultimately, neither helper nor helped possesses independent self existence. Emptiness does not cancel compassionate activity. It changes its texture. The helper becomes less substantial. The recipient becomes less fixed. The act becomes less possessive, and response remains. This is the extraordinary contribution represented by Kondrakurti. Emptiness can remove solidity without removing significance. The being is not a permanent metaphysical object called the victim, yet suffering is not nothing. The helper is not a self-grounding savior, yet action remains meaningful. The compassionate response becomes capable of seeing through solidity without seeing through significance. Non-referential compassion and the gift. At first, compassion possesses an obvious structure. I am compassionate toward you. This is natural and perhaps unavoidable. As wisdom deepens, every element loosens. Who is the giver? Who is the recipient? What exactly is the independently possessed compassionate act? The Mahayana analysis of generosity makes the practical meaning especially clear. Ordinary giving easily produces three possessions. I gave, this is what I gave, and you received it from me. From these arise subtle claims upon gratitude, memory, loyalty, reciprocity, recognition, and debt. Mature giving increasingly releases these claims. The giver does not have to remain permanently installed inside the recipient's story. The gift does not need to become an invisible contract. The recipient does not become personal property through gratitude. Social gratitude still matters. Relationships can legitimately involve reciprocity. The deeper point is that the compassionate act need not become metaphysical property. Give, allow the giving to occur, and let the act go. This is where the compassionate-liberative and subtractive axial modes touch closely. Subtraction releases possession. Compassion continues responding after possession is released. The resulting inversion is important. The ownership dissolves more completely than the responsiveness. The freedom to become unnecessary. One of the clearest tests of mature compassion occurs when someone helped becomes stronger. They no longer ask for advice, money, protection, guidance, or emotional rescue. They may even disagree with the helper. Does the helper experience injury after everything I did for you, or satisfaction? You can stand. Where the purpose of care was legitimately developmental, compassion contains the capacity to welcome its own decreasing importance, to desire another person's freedom strongly enough to welcome one's own redundancy is one of compassion's purest fruits. The parent watches a child mature beyond parental control. The teacher watches the student become intellectually independent. The therapist becomes unnecessary. The spiritual guide releases the disciple. The supporter steps away when continued intervention would become interference. Again, not every helping relationship can or should disappear. Some forms of care endure. What must disappear wherever possible is not necessarily relationship, but the compulsory structure of dependency. The mature helper can remain loved without remaining needed. Non transactionality and rejoicing. The same maturation weakens the demand for return. Much ordinary human relationship appropriately depends upon reciprocity, but a compassionate act can retain meaning even where repayment never arrives. The recipient may forget, misunderstand, or never know who helped them. The compassionate act need not secretly purchase gratitude, obedience, identity, or emotional debt. This capacity is tested equally by another person's suffering and flourishing. Someone becomes healthier, more independent, more successful, loved elsewhere, or capable of things the helper could not attain. Can the heart rejoice? The point of compassion was never suffering. The point was a freedom. A helper attached to the wounded may discover that the recipient's recovery removes the very role through which the helper experienced purpose. Sympathetic joy therefore carries compassion beyond attachment to its own operation. May you become so free that my compassion no longer needs to take the form of helping you. Compassion without discouragement. As the field of concern expands, discouragement becomes inevitable unless compassion relinquishes its demand for completion. Suffering does not stop. One crisis ends and another begins. A war ends while another conflict starts. One person recovers and another becomes ill. Historical harms are repaired only partially. Entire systems may reproduce suffering faster than an individual can respond. Mature compassion develops something like non despondent concern. This is not optimism. Optimism expects favorable outcomes. Compassion can survive without that guarantee. The person acts because suffering is worth responding to, not because history has promised visible completion. The inability to save everything does not become an argument for saving nothing. The same realism produces patience. People change slowly. Insight does not equal capacity. Someone may know that a relationship, substance, habit, or worldview is destructive and remain unable to leave it. They may repeat the same pattern, regress, resist, and require years before something intellectually understood becomes emotionally possible. Patience does not mean endless enabling. It means recognizing that the tempo of liberation belongs partly to causes outside the helper's control. The helper may create conditions, teach, support, protect, encourage, confront, or withdraw. Transformation itself cannot simply be inserted from outside. Fierceness. As concern matures, it becomes capable of fierceness. If another being truly matters, there are situations in which passivity becomes impossible. The endangered need protection. Abuse may require interruption. A deception may require exposure. A destructive structure may require opposition. Compassion, therefore, cannot remain trapped inside one aesthetic of gentleness. Its emotional center can remain non hateful while its action becomes extremely firm. The mode does not ask what allows the person to appear compassionate, it asks what serves the reduction of suffering and restoration of freedom in this actual situation. Sometimes the answer is tenderness, sometimes prohibition. Maturity is flexibility of expression without loss of orientation. From practice to disposition. At earlier stages, compassionate conduct requires deliberate effort. One remembers principles, interrupts irritation, practices generosity, imagines another person's perspective, and attempts patience. This work should not be despised. Virtues often begin as intentional corrections to habitual structures. Over time, the orientation may become less manufactured. Concern enters temperament. The refusal of indifference becomes more spontaneous even when the specific response still requires thought and discernment. The developmental movement can be stated simply: I ought to care. I care. I understand more clearly what care requires. I act without needing the action to establish who I am. Eventually, response becomes more natural. This does not mean infallibility or perpetual sweetness. It means that concern no longer has to be dragged into existence against the entire weight of self centered habit. The mature bodhisattva paradox. We can now return to the apparently impossible vow. At first, it may sound like, I will personally liberate every being in the universe. At maturity, its meaning has changed. All beings means that there is no final boundary beyond which suffering becomes metaphysically irrelevant. I will liberate becomes an orientation of whatever capacities actually arise through this life toward conditions of freedom rather than bondage. Emptiness means that neither I, nor those beings, nor the act of liberation can become fixed possessions. Wisdom means that response must fit reality rather than merely express my desire to help. The vow therefore expands and humbles the person simultaneously. Care without final exclusion. But do not imagine yourself lord of the beings you care for. Continue despite the endlessness of suffering, but do not require the universe to conform to your personal project. Work for liberation, and release ownership of who liberates whom. The words remain enormous, the claimant becomes smaller. The mature fruit. The mature fruit of the compassionate liberative mode is not simply kindness, maximal empathy, endless service, universal emotional warmth, or heroic self sacrifice. It is a complex integration in which another being can matter deeply without becoming possessed. The person becomes increasingly capable of allowing suffering to matter without appropriating it, seeing causes rather than symptoms alone, responding to immediate suffering without despising immediate relief, working toward deeper freedom without imposing one predetermined image of freedom, adapting action to the actual person, preserving concern when gratitude disappears, respecting agency, remaining compassionate toward wrongdoing without becoming morally blind, accepting the limits of personal power without collapsing into indifference, and allowing the identity of the compassionate person to become progressively unnecessary. At its highest development, compassion becomes almost transparent. Suffering appears. It is seen. If response is possible, response occurs. If nothing can be done, concern need not close. There is less declaration, I am helping, less possession, I saved this person, less cosmic inflation, I shall repair creation, less withdrawal, since I cannot save everyone, nothing matters, something quieter remains, another being is real, freedom matters, respond where response is possible, release what does not belong to you. Distortion and self-sealing. The compassionate liberative mode possesses unusual moral prestige. It is difficult to criticize someone who is helping, difficult to question a movement speaking the language of service, difficult to challenge a teacher claiming to act for the student's welfare, and difficult to resist a family member who says that love requires sacrifice. This makes compassion's shadow particularly dangerous. Other spiritual distortions often reveal their self interest more openly. The ambitious person seeks power, the ascetic seeks purity, the intellectual may seek superiority, but a compassionate personality can pursue power, dependence, recognition, conformity, or control while sincerely experiencing itself as selfless. The central pathology is therefore not absence of concern, it is something subtler. The helper ceases to be corrigible because helping itself has become evidence of goodness. Once this happens, compassion begins sealing itself against reality. The birth of the Savior. Compassion begins with another being suffering. Saviorism begins when the helper's identity moves into the center. Someone needs help. One responds, the response succeeds. Gratitude follows. The helper discovers that being useful provides meaning. None of this is pathological. The danger appears when usefulness becomes existentially necessary. The person no longer merely wants suffering to decrease. They need to become the one through whom it decreases. Compassion says, may you become free. The Savior adds, may you become free through me. And beneath that can appear something darker. May you become free, but not so completely that I cease to be necessary. The relationship then begins preserving the very dependency it claims to overcome. Advice becomes constant. Problems are solved before the recipient can struggle with them. Crisis repeatedly reactivates intimacy. The recipient learns that helplessness brings closeness. The helper learns that helplessness confirms purpose. Neither person may intend this consciously. The relationship nevertheless organizes itself around rescue. The savior shadow becomes visible precisely where compassion ought to celebrate its own decreasing importance. The need to be needed. This need can become the hidden emotional engine of enormous service. A person may counsel constantly, give money, organize communities, remain endlessly available, and become known as the one who never refuses anyone. Much of the activity may genuinely help, yet inwardly another question begins forming. Without other people needing me, who am I? Suffering becomes the environment within which the compassionate identity knows itself. Someone must require guidance, rescue, protection, or emotional availability. The helper becomes frightened not only by suffering but by the possibility of becoming unnecessary. This is why sympathetic joy is such a severe test. Can the helper rejoice when another person becomes strong enough that their role shrinks? If not, helping contains possession, the moral hostage, and self erasure. Compassion can also become a technique of coercion through one simple formula. If you cared, you would do this. Refusal is no longer treated as a decision. It becomes evidence of selfishness, coldness, insufficient empathy, lack of love, or spiritual immaturity. The demand itself need not be justified because compassion has already classified resistance as morally suspect. This mechanism appears in families, religious communities, intimate relationships, helping professions, and political movements. Another person's need becomes an automatic claim upon someone else's life. But need does not create unlimited jurisdiction. The suffering may be real, the compassionate answer may still be no. The moral hostage structure becomes especially powerful when someone has already learned to distrust their boundaries. Every refusal produces guilt before reasoning begins. Instead of asking whether the request is appropriate, the person asks what is wrong with them for not wanting to give. A related distortion excludes the helper themselves from the field of compassion. Their sleep, health, privacy, money, family, psychological stability, and future can all be consumed. The more they suffer, the more spiritually serious service appears. Eventually, suffering becomes evidence of goodness, but disowned needs do not disappear. They return through resentment, passive aggression, control, exhaustion, moral superiority, and invisible accounting. After everything I have done for you, the sentence reveals the ledger. Self erasure can create a self made powerful through sacrifice. Compassion as control. Concern naturally wants favorable outcomes. The parent wants the child safe. The teacher wants the student to learn. The healer wants the patient well. The spiritual guide wants the disciple free. Concern becomes control when the desired outcome begins justifying reduction of the other person's agency. The logic is seductive. I know what is good for you, therefore, resistance is ignorance. Therefore, overriding resistance may itself be compassionate. The other person has become an object of benevolent management. This can happen even when the helper is correct. The advice may truly be wise. The recipient may genuinely be making a destructive choice. Yet liberation cannot be reduced to manufacturing the correct outcome through another person's submission. Methods form people. Repeatedly solving a person's life for them may create someone increasingly incapable of solving it themselves. The compassionate intention has produced anti-liberative consequences. Compassion without discernment. Good intention does not suspend causality. Money can support addiction. Constant rescue can strengthen helplessness. Removing every consequence can prevent maturation. Reassurance can strengthen avoidance. Attention can reinforce manipulation. The motive is compassionate. The outcome is bondage. Good intention does not exempt compassionate action from causality. Mature compassion therefore has to tolerate an uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes not giving is more compassionate than giving. Sometimes allowing a manageable consequence is more liberative than removing it. This is difficult because neglect and wise restraint can look similar from outside. No slogan can decide the matter. Discernment is required. A related distortion is addiction to immediate relief. Another person is distressed, so distress must disappear. Yet learning can require frustration. Grief cannot always be shortened. Withdrawal from destructive habits can hurt. Accountability is uncomfortable. Truth may wound. And a child developing independence must sometimes struggle. Compassion must distinguish unnecessary suffering from difficulty that belongs to growth. If relief itself becomes the measure of goodness, boundaries become cruelty, truth becomes cruelty, consequences become cruelty, and the person is protected into increasing fragility. Emotional fusion. Another distortion appears when closeness becomes indistinguishable from shared dysregulation. If you hurt, I must hurt with you. The more suffering appears, the more intensely the helper mirrors it. This may feel like exceptional empathy, but the person already suffering can become responsible for managing two nervous systems, their own and the helper's reaction to their pain. The helper may panic, cry more intensely, become furious, make promises, demand action, or search desperately for meaning. Emotional fusion feels intimate while reducing actual availability. Mature compassion is moved without being swallowed. The shadow confuses shared dysregulation with love. Compassion as moral superiority. The compassionate identity can become an unusually secure form of spiritual narcissism. The person need not say, I am superior. They say, I care. The implication follows automatically. Others are colder, more selfish, less awakened, less generous, less concerned with suffering. Criticism then becomes difficult because every criticism can be interpreted as evidence that the critic lacks compassion. The person may become harsh while remaining convinced of tenderness, manipulative while believing themselves selfless, controlling while calling control care, and morally aggressive while interpreting aggression as defense of the vulnerable. The shadow is difficult to see because the person may never experience themselves as powerful. They experience themselves as good. This makes one capacity indispensable. The helper must be able to recognize their own cruelty. Anger must sometimes be admitted as anger rather than automatically renamed righteous concern. The wish for revenge cannot always be sanctified as justice. Control cannot always be called protection. Unowned aggression becomes more dangerous precisely because the compassionate persona gives it sacred authorization. Institutional compassion and proselytism. Individual saviorism becomes more powerful when institutionalized. An organization declares a compassionate mission: feed people, educate children, heal society, liberate the oppressed, save souls, serve humanity. The mission may be sincere. Institutions also possess survival needs: money, membership, influence, legitimacy, loyalty, growth. Gradually, these interests may fuse with the compassionate mission until what benefits the institution becomes indistinguishable from what benefits people. Growth becomes morally protected because greater institutional power is interpreted as greater capacity to help. The person begins to disappear behind the metric. This is particularly sharp in religious proselytism. If the institution believes it possesses the highest liberating truth, then conversion can appear to be the highest form of compassion. Persuasion becomes service, pressure becomes persistence, manipulation becomes skillful means, numerical targets become spiritual metrics. The stranger ceases to be encountered without conclusion. The central test is devastatingly simple. If this person completely refuses our teaching, does their life remain equally real to us? If not, service has become partially instrumental. The same principle applies beyond religion. A charitable, political, therapeutic, educational, or humanitarian system must remain capable of distinguishing service to the person from service to the system through the person. The hardest institutional question is, does the system genuinely want those it serves to become capable of no longer needing the system, wherever that is realistically possible? If the answer becomes uncertain, compassion has begun serving its own continuation. Permanent victims. Compassion can become anti-liberative by freezing a person inside the identity through which compassion first encountered them. Someone has suffered. Recognition, justice, protection, or care may be required. Yet the helper or institution begins seeing the person primarily as victim. Their agency disappears beneath vulnerability. Every future action is interpreted through the wound. The compassionate gaze imprisons the person inside the condition from which compassion supposedly wants to liberate them. A victim is also a chooser, worker, thinker, friend, creator, difficult person, resilient person, flawed person, and potentially even an aggressor in another context. Compassion becomes distorted when victimhood becomes too morally useful to release. The suffering must remain visible without becoming the whole identity of the sufferer. The need for suffering to continue. At the collective level, an even darker possibility appears. A profession, movement, institution, or compassionate identity may become economically or psychologically dependent upon the persistence of the problem it addresses. No conscious malice is required. Nobody needs to wish that suffering continue. The structure itself creates dependency. If the problem disappears, funding, roles, communities, status, meaning, and institutional identity may disappear with it. The system can become better adapted to managing suffering than eliminating the conditions that reproduce it. This is one of liberative compassion's deepest tests. Does the helper truly desire an outcome in which this relationship of helping is no longer required? Where enduring care is necessary, the question changes. Does the system seek maximum agency and dignity, or does it preserve unnecessary dependency because dependency serves the institution? Cosmic saviorism. The psychological structure of saviorism can expand from individual relationships to the entire universe. The compassionate person encounters suffering and concludes not merely that unnecessary suffering should be reduced, but that a world containing vulnerability is fundamentally wrong. Difference produces misunderstanding. Embodiment permits injury. Freedom permits error. Relationship permits loss. Time produces decay. Creation itself becomes suspect. The practitioner silently positions themselves outside manifestation as its judge. They know what existence should have been and imagine their spiritual task as correcting its design. This is compassion becoming metaphysical grandiosity. The problem is not the wish that suffering decrease, it is the expansion of jurisdiction. The compassionate person is a participant in existence, not its final administrator. The mode can heal, protect, educate, oppose cruelty, change structures, and seek liberation without pretending to possess the total architecture within which finitude appears. Utopian compassion. When cosmic saviorism enters politics, the danger intensifies. A movement imagines a world without oppression, ignorance, violence, inequality, or suffering. The original impulse may be genuinely compassionate. Then actual people begin resisting the path toward the ideal. They are backward, ignorant, impure, obstacles. And eventually people are harmed in the name of a future in which nobody will be harmed. The image of universal welfare can make particular people expendable. Mature compassion must therefore remain suspicious whenever an abstraction called humanity becomes more real than the human being subjected to its methods. This is not an argument against reform. Compassion naturally asks whether institutions can be made less destructive. It is an argument against allowing the imagined future to cancel the dignity of the present person. Selective compassion. The opposite distortion occurs when compassion is intense within one group and disappears outside it. Our victims matter, their victims do not. Our children matter, their children are collateral. Our suffering deserves context, their suffering is deserved. The compassionate emotion may be completely genuine. Its boundary remains invisible to the person experiencing it. This is why the enemy test cannot be removed from the mode. The question is not whether affection toward an enemy is possible or desirable. It is simpler. Does their suffering retain any moral reality once they stand outside my circle? If not, compassion remains subordinate to tribe. Moral simplification and the inflation of empathy. Compassion can also collapse moral complexity into one equation. Someone suffers, therefore they are innocent. Yet suffering and innocence are not identical. A wounded person can harm others. A community victimized in one context can be oppressive in another. A traumatized person can behave destructively. Mature compassion must be able to hold both. You were harmed, you harmed someone. Complexity can feel like betrayal, but compassion becomes morally blind when recognition of suffering abolishes responsibility. Empathy can produce a related epistemic error. I feel their pain becomes therefore I understand the entire situation, but projection can feel exactly like understanding. Emotional resonance reveals that one is affected. It does not prove complete knowledge of motives, causes, responsibility, or the best intervention. The compassionate person needs the humility to say, I care deeply, and I may still be wrong. Without this, compassion becomes epistemically arrogant. Compassion, fatigue, and cynicism. When concern functions without boundaries, rest, differentiation, and realistic responsibility, its opposite often emerges. The person attempts to remain open to more suffering than the organism can metabolize. Concern becomes exhaustion. Exhaustion becomes numbness. Numbness becomes irritation. Irritation becomes contempt. The helper begins blaming those they serve. Why do they never change? Why are they always needy? Why does nothing improve? The person swings from everyone matters to nobody deserves anything. This does not necessarily reveal that compassion was false. It may reveal that compassion was asked to function under impossible conditions. An unbounded compassionate identity can manufacture its own cynicism as the psyche tries to survive. The self-sealing compassionate system. The deepest pathology appears when compassion becomes impossible to correct. If someone objects, they are selfish. If they set a boundary, they lack compassion. If effectiveness is questioned, the critic cares more about methods than people. If a recipient refuses help, they are ungrateful or ignorant. If the institution is criticized, the critic is attacking the vulnerable. If the helper becomes exhausted, their devotion is weak. If an intervention causes harm, the intention was good. Every contradiction is absorbed. The compassionate system becomes unfalsifiable. It no longer asks, "Did this help?" It asks, "Was I motivated by compassion?" And because the helper already identifies as compassionate, the answer is guaranteed. Reality has lost jurisdiction. The return of the master criterion. Here, the hidden criterion that eventually confronts every spiritual mode becomes unavoidable. Can reality still correct the person? For compassion, this is brutally concrete. Did the recipient become freer? Did suffering actually decrease? Was the help wanted? Was agency preserved? Did dependency increase? Did the helper become controlling? Did the institution benefit more than the people? Did consequences contradict the stated purpose? Can the helper say, "I was trying to help and I made this worse"? This may be one of compassion's highest signs because it places the reality of the other person above the helper's moral self-image. The shadow of compassion follows a recognizable sequence. Sensitivity becomes responsibility for everyone. Responsibility becomes ownership. Ownership becomes control. Control becomes moral authority. Moral authority becomes immunity from criticism. The gift has become an empire. The corrective is not less compassion. It is compassion returned to its deepest purpose. The other must become real again, not victim, convert, dependent, beneficiary, case, or material for a universal project, but a subject whose dignity may require the helper to give, confront, wait, withdraw, learn, or become unnecessary. Compassion becomes corrupted whenever helping matters more than the freedom of the one being helped, and it becomes self-sealing whenever the helper's goodness matters more than the truth of what the help actually does. Testing it in life. Spiritual qualities are easiest to admire in abstraction. Universal concern sounds luminous, while nobody is making unreasonable demands. Love of enemies sounds elevated before an actual enemy appears. Generosity sounds beautiful before resources become scarce. Non-attachment to gratitude sounds simple before gratitude fails to come. Respect for agency sounds obvious until someone chooses badly. The compassionate liberative mode must therefore be tested where its ideals collide with ordinary life. The question is not whether someone believes in compassion, performs compassionate acts, or is publicly regarded as kind. The deeper test is, what happens when compassion becomes inconvenient, ineffective, unrecognized, refused, or incapable of controlling the outcome? Can reality correct the helper? Every spiritual mode eventually encounters something it cannot honestly interpret away. For compassion, this is often the actual result of helping. The intention was good. What happened? Did the other person become stronger or more dependent? More capable of judgment or more afraid of disappointing the helper? Did generosity increase options or reinforce avoidance? Did the intervention solve a problem or merely postpone it? Did the helper's involvement become one of the conditions preserving the problem? Sincerity matters, but sincerity does not cancel causality. A compassionate intervention can fail. It can even harm. The mature person must be capable of saying, "I meant well and I was wrong." This sentence protects the mode from turning moral identity into immunity. With it, reality remains sovereign. Can compassion hear no? One of the clearest tests is refusal. Advice is rejected. Help is declined. A spiritual teaching is ignored. Money is refused. Reconciliation is not accepted. What happens internally? Does concern remain, Or does irritation appear immediately because the helper has lost the role they expected? Refusal exposes hidden ownership. If compassion depends upon being accepted, the helper's identity has entered the act. Mature compassion allows another person to say no without automatically translating refusal into ignorance, pride, ingratitude, self destruction, or spiritual immaturity. Sometimes the refusal may indeed be unwise. Another person's freedom includes the possibility of using freedom badly. The key test is, can I continue to recognize your dignity after you reject my solution? This is especially important where religion or ideology is involved. If someone refuses the worldview through which I understand their suffering, do I still see them, or do they collapse into a category? A related test concerns method. Would I consider a technique of pressure, emotional manipulation, concealment, or guilt acceptable if someone used it to move me toward a worldview I rejected? This reversibility exposes benevolent coercion quickly. Can the helper become unnecessary? Suppose someone who once depended heavily upon help becomes more stable. They make decisions independently, stop asking for advice, no longer require financial support, or stop regarding the helper as central. What happens? Good, you can stand. Or, after everything I did for you, now you no longer need me. The second response reveals that help had become relational property. The disappearance of unnecessary dependence is not the failure of compassion. It may be its success. The mature doctor wants the patient discharged where discharge is possible. The teacher wants the student capable of thought beyond instruction. The parent wants the child to mature beyond parental control. The guide does not seek permanent ownership of the disciple. Where care must continue, the same principle appears differently. Can the person receiving help grow in voice, participation, choice, dignity, and influence over the care itself? Can dependence remain a practical fact without becoming an identity imposed by the helper? The test is not crude independence. It is whether care enlarges rather than colonizes whatever freedom is realistically available. Can compassion maintain limits? A person asks for more time, more money, more availability, more emotional labor, more access. Eventually, the helper becomes depleted. Can the helper say, I care about you, and I cannot do this? An immature, compassionate identity experiences the sentence as contradiction. If I care, I must continue. If I stop, I am selfish. This belief has no natural endpoint. There is always another need, crisis, injustice, message, or suffering being somewhere. A finite nervous system cannot remain continuously open to all of it. Boundaries therefore preserve compassion from becoming obligation and resentment. But boundaries have their own shadow. Exhaustion may produce counterdependence. I owe nobody anything. Everyone must solve their own problems. Compassion only creates weakness. Maturity lies elsewhere. Can I say no without needing to make the person asking morally worthless? I cannot give you, this does not need to become you are contemptible. Leaving a relationship does not require denying the humanity of the person left. The same applies to stopping altogether. Can the compassionate person rest while suffering still exists? Can they sleep, laugh, create, enjoy beauty, and enter ordinary life without feeling that every unspent moment is a moral failure? If not, compassion has become allegiance to suffering rather than orientation toward liberation. Can compassion remain discerning and fierce? Compassion must know where its competence ends. Good intention can produce dangerous overconfidence. Spiritual teachers giving medical advice, friends assuming empathy can replace professional intervention, religious communities treating every psychological problem through doctrine, volunteers imagining enthusiasm can substitute for skill. Sometimes the most compassionate sentence is, I am not qualified for this. The recipient may need someone who knows more. Compassion proves its non possession when the helper values the actual welfare of the person more than retaining the role of helper. Discernment is equally necessary around moral complexity. Can suffering be recognized without turning suffering into proof of innocence? Can the person say both you were harmed and you harmed someone? Can concern remain present without erasing responsibility? Then comes fierceness. Some people preserve their identity as compassionate by avoiding necessary confrontation. They continue understanding when protection is required. They postpone action because firmness feels spiritually harsh. Mature compassion must sometimes exclude, expose, resist, prohibit, or defend. Can I act firmly without needing hatred, and remain compassionate without using compassion as an excuse for cowardice? The enemy test and the fierceness test belong together. Compassion toward an aggressor must not abandon the vulnerable. Protection of the vulnerable does not require delight in degradation of the aggressor. Can the helper remain present without fixing? Many forms of suffering cannot be solved immediately. Some cannot be solved at all. The compassionate person then encounters helplessness. If I cannot fix this, what am I doing here? Sometimes the answer is staying, listening, witnessing, accompanying, or preventing isolation. Can concern survive when suffering offers no opportunity for successful intervention? Can I remain near suffering when it provides no chance to become successful at helping? This cuts directly through saviorism. A related test is tragedy. Some losses cannot be undone. Some bodies will not recover. Some relationships cannot be restored. Some historical events cannot be corrected. The protest, "this should not have happened," may remain legitimate. Reality may nevertheless refuse repair. Mature compassion learns that care does not require omnipotence. It can remain alive after the fantasy of complete repair has died. Does compassion survive invisibility and ungratefulness? Public compassion can bring admiration, social status, religious prestige, institutional authority, and a coherent identity. The hidden test is what happens when nobody sees. Would the person still perform the small, unattractive act if no story could be told afterward? Does concern remain where compassion produces no public identity? Gratitude creates a similar test. Gratitude is natural and beautiful, but does its absence turn giving into moral accounting? I gave you so much, you owe me, I sacrificed for you. The ledger reveals that the act was stored as debt. Mature compassion does not require gratitude to become meaningless. It refuses to convert gratitude into ownership. A related test appears when somebody else receives credit. If the purpose has genuinely been served, does recognition remain secondary? Do I want the good outcome, or do I need to be known as its source? Does the other remain a subject? Almost every distortion of compassion eventually reduces the other person to a role: victim, patient, disciple, convert, dependent, beneficiary, case, problem, cause, someone to save. The mature mode repeatedly restores subjecthood. The person before us has a history, preferences, contradictions, strengths, weaknesses, values, a capacity for judgment, a right to refusal, and a capacity to surprise us. Their life exceeds the place they occupy within our compassion. This produces the deepest test. Does my compassion make room for the other person to remain more than the object of my care? The person helped must remain capable of correcting the helper. They can say, "Your help is overwhelming me. I do not want this. You are treating me like a child. Your system is serving itself more than us." Can the helper hear it? The compassionate mode matures when the recipient remains a source of knowledge rather than merely an object of benevolence. Reality as the final teacher. Compassion does not mature by perfecting an image of goodness, it matures by remaining corrigible. The suffering person corrects it. Consequences correct it. Failure corrects it. Boundaries correct it. Expertise corrects it. Refusal corrects it. The enemy corrects it. The exhaustion of the helper corrects it. Reality repeatedly asks, "Did this actually help?" Perhaps the deepest test is therefore the same one that eventually confronts every spiritual mode. Can reality still say no? No, this help is not useful. No, this person does not want what you offer. No, you cannot save them. No, you are not responsible for everyone. No, suffering cannot always be removed. No, your intention does not excuse the consequence. No, your compassionate identity does not make you infallible. And sometimes, no, there is nothing more for you to do. These refusals do not defeat compassion. They return it to proportion. They strip away ownership, preserve agency, and prevent service from becoming empire. The central operation returns to something very simple: see clearly, care genuinely, respond intelligently, let reality determine what help actually means. Traditions, exemplars, and configurations. The compassionate liberative mode is unusual because its mature fruit may appear almost completely outside the forms normally recognized as mystical. A visionary may be recognized through revelation, an ascetic through discipline, a ritualist through sacred practice, an architect through the systems they construct. Compassion may become visible in something far less spectacular: patience with a difficult person, refusal to abandon someone vulnerable, the ability to remain near suffering without possessing it, or action undertaken for someone incapable of providing anything in return. No single tradition owns this mode. Mahayana Buddhism developed perhaps its most elaborate spiritual architecture, joining compassion, bodhicitta, emptiness, skillful means, and the bodhisattva path into an extraordinary whole. Yet similar operations appear through very different metaphysical worlds. Christian love of neighbor and enemy, Hindu forms of seva, devotional service, contemplative prayer for others, and secular lives in which suffering simply becomes impossible to treat as significant only when it belongs to oneself. The traditions should not be collapsed into one doctrine. What recurs is an operation. The boundary of concern widens. Suffering calls forth response, and mature response increasingly seeks the other's freedom rather than possession of the role of helper. Mahayana, compassion near the center. Among major spiritual traditions, Mahayana Buddhism gives compassion an unusually structural role. Awakening is not framed merely as private release. Bodhicitta joins awakening itself to the welfare and liberation of beings, while bodhisattva discipline requires this aspiration to become conduct. Its most distinctive achievement, however, is not simply making compassion more universal. Compassion is taken directly into the deepest questions of selfhood and reality. If beings have no independent essence, who is liberated? If the bodhisattva is likewise empty, who performs liberation? If phenomena arise dependently, what remains of the apparent duality between helper and helped? Mahayana does not normally answer by withdrawing compassion. It attempts something more difficult: to let the solidity of the compassionate subject dissolve without allowing compassionate response to disappear with it. Kandrak Erti, emptiness without indifference. Kandrak Erti stands at the philosophical center of this mode. One of the great masters of Madhyamaka analysis opens the Madhyamakavatara by giving compassion a foundational place within the Bodhisattva path. Compassion is not elementary morality waiting to be superseded by insight. Its very form deepens as insight deepens. The movement traditionally associated with these opening verses is extraordinarily precise. Compassion first apprehends suffering beings, then beings within conditioned and impermanent existence, and finally beings understood as empty of intrinsic nature. The image of reflections in moving water captures the paradox. A reflection is not an independent object hidden beneath the surface, yet there is not simply nothing. There is appearance, movement, condition, dependence. So with the suffering being. The person is not a permanent metaphysical object called the victim. Their suffering is not therefore unreal. The helper is empty. Response still occurs. The act is empty. Consequences still arise. This gives one of the purest formulations of the compassionate liberative mode. Emptiness removes solidity without removing significance. The distorted dualistic savior says, "I am here, and I shall rescue you there." A distorted non-dual response says, "Ultimately, nobody is here and nobody is there, so the entire drama belongs to ignorance." Kandrakirti opens a third possibility: see through the solidity of both and remain compassionate. The analytical blade has removed the metaphysical foundation of saviorism without removing the other from concern. The culmination is not a larger compassionate self, but progressively less self-needing to possess compassion. Shantideva, the radical expansion of concern. If Kandrakirti clarifies the philosophical paradox, Shantideva gives the mode one of its most uncompromising ethical voices. The Bodhikariyavatara pushes against the privileged status automatically granted to one's own suffering. Why should pain become morally urgent merely because it appears within the organism called me? Why should suffering elsewhere possess less significance merely because it is encountered from outside? The mature answer is not self-hatred, The self does not become worthless, it loses its monopoly. My suffering matters, so does yours. My desire for freedom is intelligible, therefore yours becomes intelligible as well. Self reference ceases to function as an adequate measure of value. This radical widening can be badly imitated as self erasure, but at maturity it means that the practitioner no longer needs the word mind before suffering can become morally visible. Avalokiteshvara. Compassion as archetype. Where Kandrakarti gives philosophical anatomy and Santideva ethical radicalization, Avalokiteshvara gives the mode symbolic form. In later Buddhist iconography, the many arms and eyes provide an extraordinary image. Suffering arises in innumerable places. Therefore, compassion acquires innumerable eyes. Response takes innumerable forms. Therefore, compassion acquires innumerable hands. This need not be read as one gigantic cosmic personality frantically managing the universe. The symbol is more impersonal. Where suffering appears, may there be the capacity to see it. Where response is possible, may there be a hand. Compassion becomes larger than personality. One method cannot respond to every condition. Therefore, there are many hands. One form of teaching cannot fit every being. Therefore, compassionate intelligence remains plural. The archetype renders upaya visible. Durgaprasana Paramahamsadeva, when helping is not enough. Durgaprasana Paramahamsadeva represents a striking modern Indian configuration because compassion appears not merely as virtue but as an organizing spiritual problem. Traditional biographical accounts describe a movement from concrete assistance toward dissatisfaction with assistance that left the causes of suffering untouched. Food, money, medicine, practical treatment. These matter, yet people return. Suffering regenerates. What kind of help reaches more deeply? This is precisely the movement from compassionate to compassionate liberative consciousness. Temporary benefit does not become proof that the work is complete. The question moves from how much can be given toward what actually produces deeper freedom. An important corrective appears here as well. The desire to serve does not itself prove the capacity to serve. The helper must become an instrument less likely to transmit confusion through the act of helping. The desire to help does not prove the capacity to help. This gives service an essential humility. The Savior imagines ownership of outcomes. The servant enters the situation and asks what reality permits. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, compassion as presence. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche represents another configuration. Here compassion appears less as social program or philosophical argument than as quality of presence. The mature fruit of a mode need not continually advertise its central operation. Concern may enter temperament so deeply that less moral effort is visible. Patience becomes easier, attention less defensive. Another person's vulnerability encounters less obstruction. Some human beings seem to create an atmosphere in which others can become less defended without becoming possessed. The person feels seen but not captured, held without being reduced to weakness. This is difficult to quantify. Metrics may miss it entirely. The compassionate self becomes quieter, while compassionate availability grows. Thich Nhat Hanh, compassion entering history. Thich Nhat Hanh represents the necessity of compassion entering historical suffering rather than remaining confined to private contemplative life. War, displacement, ideology, institutions, collective memory, and organized violence cannot be addressed through interpersonal kindness alone. The mode is forced outward. Yet the deeper question becomes whether compassionate engagement itself can avoid becoming fully colonized by tribal consciousness. A person may oppose war while becoming consumed by hatred toward those regarded as responsible. Peace activism can reproduce psychologically the structure it opposes. The challenge is, can one enter conflict without allowing conflict to determine the entire architecture of consciousness? This does not mean neutrality toward harm. It means refusing to let the enemy become ontologically simpler than oneself. Mindfulness can prevent engagement from becoming pure reaction. Engagement can prevent mindfulness from becoming withdrawal. Each corrects the other. Silouan the Athonite, compassion at the boundary of the enemy. Within Christianity, Silouan the Athonite represents compassion at perhaps its most difficult frontier, love of enemies. The enemy is precisely the person ordinary consciousness has the strongest reason to remove from concern. They harmed us. threatened us, humiliated us, perhaps harmed those we love. The psyche therefore creates an exception. Compassion is universal, except here. Silouan's spiritual configuration refuses this final exclusion. Love of enemies does not necessarily mean trusting enemies, refusing protection, abandoning justice, or declaring evil good. Its deeper operation is that the enemy cannot finally be expelled from the field of prayer and concern. The theological language differs radically from Madhyamaka, yet a recognizable operation appears. There is no final category of human being whose suffering and ultimate good become completely irrelevant. Christian universality arrives through another door. Mother Maria Skobtsova, the neighbor, becomes concrete. If Silouan represents universal compassionate prayer, Mother Maria Skobtsova represents another Christian pole, spirituality becoming radically concrete. Service among poor, displaced, vulnerable, and persecuted people turns the neighbor into spiritual reality. The universal easily becomes an abstraction. Humanity, all sentient beings, the world, the neighbor interrupts abstraction. Here, this person, this body, this hunger, this need for shelter. The universal acquires a face. The encounter with vulnerability itself becomes part of sacred life. Compassion refuses to remain magnificent theory when another human being stands immediately before it. Different doors, different metaphysics. These figures should not be homogenized. Kandrakarti is not secretly teaching Christianity. Silouan is not practicing Madhyamaka. Durga Prasanna's Hindu world is not a disguised bodhisattva system. Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged Buddhism is not identical to Dilgo Khyentse's form of presence. The metaphysics differ, the practices differ, their understandings of liberation differ. The purpose of describing a mode is not to erase traditions into a universal doctrine. It is to notice recurring operations of consciousness within genuinely different spiritual architectures. Mahayana may interpret compassion through dependent arising and emptiness. Christianity may understand the other as loved by God. A devotional Hindu may encounter service as service to the divine through beings. A secular humanitarian may begin simply from the intuition that suffering does not acquire its reality through possession by the self. No one metaphysics is required for the phenomenological threshold. Another being's reality has become difficult to dismiss. This is why no tradition owns the summit. A person can possess extremely sophisticated teachings on Mahakaruna and remain selfish. Another may never have heard the word bodhicitta and spend a life responding to vulnerable beings with extraordinary wisdom and non-possession. The sophistication of the map does not determine the depth of the traveler. Across the different configurations, however, a mature pattern becomes recognizable. Concern becomes less dependent upon reciprocity. The circle of relevance widens. Another being's suffering becomes harder to dismiss merely because they are distant, disagreeable, socially insignificant, or hostile. Compassion becomes increasingly interested in causes rather than appearances alone. The other's agency enters concern. The helper becomes more capable of becoming a necessary where possible and less threatened by flourishing. Concern survives when recognition and gratitude disappear. Action becomes adaptive rather than standardized. The person becomes more capable of remaining near suffering without appropriating it. At the deepest level, the identity of the compassionate person becomes less important than the freedom of the being before them. Ownership decreases, availability remains. The mature exemplar is therefore not necessarily someone continually overcome by universal emotion. The evidence is smaller. What happens when a difficult person enters the room, when an enemy suffers, when gratitude does not come, when help is refused, when there is no solution, when someone no longer needs us, when our institution is wrong, when compassion requires admission of ignorance? The mature form is someone in whom the barriers that ordinarily prevent response have become less rigid. The eye sees, the heart does not immediately close, discernment remains, action becomes possible, possession decreases, another being becomes real enough to matter, and the self becomes transparent enough that this recognition can become response. Return to proportion. Compassion is one of the strongest correctives to the enclosure of the self. It interrupts indifference and restores reality to beings who might otherwise remain abstractions. It resists the moral convenience through which suffering becomes significant only when it belongs to oneself, one's family, religion, community, nation, ideology, or side. At maturity, this becomes extraordinary. The person can remain near suffering without immediately fleeing, help without possessing, set boundaries without hatred, perceive causes beneath behavior, welcome another person's independence, act without recognition, and retain concern even when gratitude disappears. But compassion is not the whole of spiritual life. Like every mode, it becomes distorted when its central revelation expands into universal jurisdiction. The compassionate liberative mind must eventually learn the same lesson it seeks for others. Freedom also means knowing when not to intervene. Compassion in a larger field of values. There are situations in which compassion should dominate attention. A child is in danger, someone is starving, a person is being abused, a patient needs treatment, a frightened person requires protection. There are other circumstances in which different values become equally important: truth, justice, freedom, competence, responsibility, loyalty, courage, beauty, discipline, contemplation, wisdom. Sometimes these values cooperate, sometimes they create tension. The compassionate impulse may want immediate relief, while truth requires something painful to be spoken. Concern may want to protect someone from consequence, while responsibility requires consequence. The desire for peace may conflict with justice. The wish to help may conflict with another person's autonomy. The spiritual task is not to maximize compassion in isolation. It is to discover compassion's right proportion among other realities. This does not diminish compassion. It prevents one indispensable mode from becoming a totalitarian measure of everything. The right not to be helped. One of compassion's deepest boundaries is the freedom of the other. The compassionate mind naturally sees possible paths: a healthier choice, treatment, teaching, explanation, relationship, way out. The fact that one can imagine a better outcome does not automatically create the right to impose it. Another person may refuse. The refusal may be tragic or unwise. It can lead to greater suffering, yet agency remains part of dignity. To wish another person free means accepting that freedom can include refusal of one's help. This is not absolute. Parents have duties toward children. Immediate danger may justify intervention. Incapacity changes responsibility. But beyond these conditions, mature compassion distinguishes offering a path from claiming ownership of the walker. It can say, "I believe this would help," and sometimes you remain free to disagree. The right to struggle. Not every difficulty should be removed. Some suffering is destructive and preventable. Other difficulty belongs to learning. A child develops competence through failure. A student struggles with a problem. An artist passes through frustration. Adults acquire judgment partly through consequences. Spiritual practice may involve discomfort that exposes attachment. Compassion needs a distinction between pain that damages and difficulty that develops. There is no mechanical formula. People romanticize destructive suffering by calling it growth, and they infantilize others by interpreting every discomfort as harm. Maturity does neither. Sometimes the compassionate person stands beside someone struggling without taking the struggle away. That restraint can itself be care. Compassion, justice, and truth. Compassion sees causes. A person who harms others may have been shaped by fear, trauma, ideology, deprivation, ignorance, or violence. Justice sees that others within the same field of concern require protection. A compassionate response toward an aggressor cannot require abandoning those vulnerable to aggression. Understanding does not mean permitting. Forgiveness does not automatically restore access. Concern for a wrongdoer does not negate victims. The mature integration is protect without dehumanizing, hold accountable without needing hatred. The same integration is required around truth. Sometimes compassion wants to avoid adding pain, yet a person may be suffering partly because reality is being concealed. A relationship survives through denial. An institution protects itself through comforting narratives. Reassurance can become anti-liberative. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Timing, language, capacity, and relationship matter, but compassion cannot permanently protect someone from realities they need to encounter. Sometimes the deepest respect is, "I believe you are capable of encountering reality." Compassion and competence. Goodness does not replace skill. The compassionate person may desperately want to help and still lack the required knowledge. Mature compassion welcomes competence because the actual outcome matters more than the helper's moral identity. The surgeon needs to understand surgery. The therapist needs psychological competence. The teacher needs subject knowledge. The social worker requires practical expertise. The spiritual guide needs awareness of the limits of spiritual intervention. Love does not repair every broken bone. Sincerity does not make inaccurate advice true. Sometimes the most compassionate act is give the problem to someone who knows more. This requires surrender of importance. The helper becomes secondary to the help. The helper is also alive. Universal concern can quietly produce a strange metaphysics in which the compassionate practitioner exists only as an instrument. Their whole life becomes service infrastructure. Rest becomes selfish, pleasure morally suspicious, privacy indulgent, and personal interest difficult to justify. But the person serving is not outside the world they serve. They have a body, relationships, creative desires, limitations, need for solitude, need for joy, and a life whose value cannot be reduced to usefulness. The servant is also one of the beings included within the field of compassion. A mature, compassionate life may contain extraordinary periods of sacrifice and service, but these arise through concrete vocation and circumstance, not from the belief that personal existence becomes valuable only when consumed by others. The right to joy and rest. There is always suffering somewhere. If joy required evidence that suffering had ceased, joy would become morally impossible. Someone is hungry while another person celebrates. Someone dies while a child is born. War occurs while somebody falls in love. This simultaneity belongs to a world containing innumerable centers of experience. The compassionate person may initially feel guilt before happiness. How can I enjoy this while others suffer? Yet the question has no end point. If compassion aims toward freedom from suffering, then inability to receive happiness would contradict its own direction. Compassion belongs to life, not to an allegiance with misery. The heart can mourn where mourning belongs and rejoice where joy appears. Another person's flourishing is not morally embarrassing. It is part of what compassion wanted. Likewise, the compassionate person must be able to rest, not because suffering has stopped, but because the organism has limits. There will always be another need, message, crisis, injustice, or being in pain. No individual nervous system can remain continuously exposed. Rest returns compassion to embodiment. The person can sleep, play, walk, read, create, work, laugh, enter ordinary conversation, and enjoy beauty without constructing a moral defense for every moment not spent helping. Compassion can survive periods in which it is not being actively performed. Universal concern without cosmic possession. The Bodhisattva horizon returns here one final time because its mature dignity lies precisely in holding two truths together. Let no being be excluded from the horizon of concern, and no finite individual owns the destiny of all beings. Separated, each statement becomes dangerous. The first without the second becomes cosmic saviorism. The second without the first can become spiritual privatization in which only one's own liberation matters. Held together, they create something subtler. The compassionate person can orient themselves toward universal good while acting locally. They can wish freedom for beings they will never encounter without claiming responsibility for their fate. They can respond deeply to what enters their field without believing that everything outside the field has become a personal failure. The horizon is infinite. The human instrument remains finite. There is no contradiction. The world does not need to become a hospital. Perhaps the deepest limitation compassion must accept is that existence contains more than suffering. A compassion dominated worldview can begin interpreting everything therapeutically. Every being becomes a patient, every relationship becomes care, every institution becomes a machine for reducing harm. The world becomes a hospital. But existence contains play, beauty, eros, knowledge, art, discovery, risk, competition, creation, adventure, discipline, celebration, contemplation, mystery. Music is not necessary for suffering reduction. Poetry is not necessary. Adventure creates danger. Love makes loss possible. Freedom permits failure. Plurality permits conflict. Yet a world without these possibilities might be safer and profoundly impoverished. The absence of suffering is not the sole positive value of existence. This does not diminish the reality of suffering or justify what can responsibly be prevented. It prevents compassion from demanding that the whole universe justify itself exclusively through therapeutic criteria. The compassionate mind must relinquish the fantasy that every spiritual question is ultimately a problem of suffering reduction. The sacred is larger. Compassion without hostility toward creation. At its widest horizon, compassion may look at samsara and ask why beings suffer at all, why embodiment, why ignorance, why death, why conflict. Different traditions answer differently. The compassionate liberative mode does not need to solve the metaphysics of creation before it can act. It needs humility before a totality larger than its own operation. The person can oppose unnecessary suffering without claiming to know what a universe without vulnerability, differentiation, finitude, freedom, risk, and transformation should be. The bodhisattva need not become the cosmic engineer correcting a failed design. I do not understand the total architecture of existence. I can still respond where suffering appears. This is enough. Compassion and the other modes. Compassion reaches mature proportion when it can receive correction from other forms of consciousness. The analytical dialectical mind asks whether compassionate beliefs are true and whether proposed solutions actually work. The subtractive axial mind releases the identity of helper and loosens compulsive ownership. The ritual sacramental mind can give service durable communal form rather than leaving it dependent upon mood. The devotional relational mind can transform service into love. The visionary receptive mind may enlarge imagination beyond visible surfaces. The ascetic purificatory mind provides discipline and restraint. The transgressive transformative mind can enter places conventional goodness spheres. The integrative architectural mind situates compassion within a larger ecology so that it does not claim every spiritual problem as its own. Compassion needs these companions. Without analysis, it can become naive. Without subtraction, possessive. Without discipline, exhausted. Without boundaries, engulfed. Without architecture, totalizing. The mature spiritual ecology is not compassion replacing all other modes. It is compassion becoming one indispensable voice among several indispensable voices. The other does not belong to compassion. At the beginning of the mode, another person often becomes visible through suffering. At maturity, they must become larger than suffering. A person is not merely someone to help. They may be funny, difficult, brilliant, ordinary, strong, annoying, creative, selfish, generous, ambitious, confused. They may not need compassion from us at all. The compassionate gaze can itself become reductive when vulnerability is always the first thing it sees. There are moments when the highest respect is to encounter another person without helping them. Not patient, not victim, not disciple, not beneficiary, simply another human being. The mode returns fully to proportion when another person no longer needs to be suffering in order to become real. The return from service. There is a moment when help ends, the crisis passes, the person stands, the relationship changes, nothing dramatic remains. This is not failure. The compassionate liberative mode does not seek to preserve a permanent universe divided into helpers and helped. Wherever possible, its mature movement tends toward the dissolution of that structure. The recipient becomes agent, the student becomes independent, the protected person gains capacity, the grieving person returns to life, and the helper returns to their own life. This return belongs to compassion. The mode does not need to remain central forever. At its proper scale, compassion becomes neither sentimental softness nor cosmic mission. It becomes a stable capacity to allow another being's reality to matter, to see suffering, distinguish what can be changed from what cannot, respond where response genuinely serves freedom, withdraw where intervention becomes possession, confront where protection requires firmness, accept the limits of personal power, remain open without being consumed, care without demanding gratitude, recognize enemies without requiring their suffering, allow another person to flourish beyond one's help, rest, rejoice, and live. The mature, compassionate, liberative mind no longer says, I must save everyone, nor, nothing can ultimately be done. It inhabits the difficult space between omnipotence and indifference. Its orientation can be universal. Its action remains particular. Its concern can be immense. Its claims upon the world become modest. It knows that another being's suffering is real, without imagining that all suffering belongs to it. It knows that freedom matters without claiming the right to dictate what every being's freedom must look like. It knows that helping can be sacred and that leaving another person alone can sometimes be equally sacred. Its final movement may therefore be expressed simply: see the other, let them matter, do what genuinely serves freedom. Do not make their life your possession, then release even the identity of having been compassionate. The world continues. Beings suffer, beings flourish. Some accept help, some refuse it, some become free in ways we recognize, others take paths we cannot understand. The compassionate person neither closes the heart nor assumes command of creation. They remain one finite being among innumerable beings capable of responding where life places them and incapable of determining the whole. And this is enough. The horizon of concern can remain limitless without the person becoming limitless.